He bought silence with a credit card and a laugh. Marcus Vale, the Playboy heir with a reputation for wagers and careless charm, placed a bet that would unravel everything he thought he owned. It happened in a private room of an exclusive club in Miami, where the air smelled of expensive cologne and the low music kept secrets afloat. He was surrounded by men with immaculate shirts and empty consciences, and he smiled as if the city itself answered to him. Julian Price, the friend who loved to provoke, threw down a challenge wrapped in mockery and champagne. The wager was simple in words and poisonous in intent. Marry a woman who did not belong to the world he built and remain married for 6 months. The woman chosen to be the point of that joke was not a caricature meant to be broken. Lila Hart walked into the club with a slow, steady rhythm, carrying a bag that had seen better days and a look that did not ask for pity. She was larger than the models Marcus flashed in his life, but her eyes were sharp and unashamed. She said plainly that she would accept with her own conditions. That single refusal tightened the knot in Marcus Vale's chest in a way his money had never managed. What Marcus did not realize that night was that Lila had reasons that reached back through lost letters and hidden tribunals, reasons that would force him to face the ruins of choices he had buried. The bet would be the hinge. What began as sport would become a ledger of debts, a tally of pain and leverage, and ultimately a test of whether a man of privilege could learn to apologize with action rather than with a pocketful of cash. Will he find the courage to pay what he owes, not in money but in truth and labor? Stay with this story to witness what he loses and what he must rebuild. They met on a humid evening in late July, the city lights reflected on marble and glass. Marcus arrived on time, his smile a practiced curve. Lila arrived with the smell of home cooking still clinging to her coat and a readiness that cut through the polished air. Julian announced the terms like an auctioneer, voice booming over polite laughter. Marcus accepted publicly, to applause and betting slips, and privately because he believed no woman could stay indifferent within his orbit. Lila set boundaries with the same clarity she used to negotiate wages at the community center where she worked. The contract was written on cocktail napkins and confirmed with a handshake. They had a small ceremony, a photographer with a soft flash, and within a week they signed their names on a brief legal agreement that guaranteed 6 months of married life and a payoff if either party walked away prematurely. The arrival at Marcus Vale Tower was cinematic. The penthouse that had been his cathedral was all concrete geometry, floor-to-ceiling windows, and rooms tuned to echo approval. Lila stepped out of the elevator and listened to the silence the estate offered, unfazed. Marcus filled rooms with art and sound, but Lila carried a quiet that made the art look like ornaments of vanity. Guests arrived with the expectation of entertainment and spectacle. Some threw sideways looks at the bride who did not fit a certain ideal. Others watched with curiosity, eyes attempting to reconcile the imposing man and the unvarnished woman in his arms. Early days were a study in friction. Marcus offered jewels in praise. Lila declined the jewels and brewed coffee in a chipped mug. There were arguments, public and private, orchestrated by Julian and filtered by the tabloids. In the living room at midnight, Marcus asked why she refused the gowns he bought, and she answered with a story about a dress hanger that had been the only thing left from a mother who could not keep a home. The exchange was electric. Marcus had never had to listen to such a memory. He had never been required to hold someone without the buffer of money. Scenes of negotiation repeated. Marcus learned that influence does not sway conviction. He tried to arrange charity dinners and photo ops where Lila could display gratitude. Lila refused the performance, insisting that work had to be real. She walked to a food pantry in sneakers and turned down a limo. The staff of the penthouse reacted in varied ways. Serena Cole, his assistant, rolled her eyes at the trouble, but she also started to listen more. Marco Alvarez, the chef, treated Lila with the deference he showed to honest people and kept a bowl of warm soup on the counter whenever she visited. Caroline Pierce, a local journalist who had been watching Marcus for years, smelled a headline and began asking questions that landed like stones. Detective Aaron Shaw, who had handled one of Marcus' family's corporate investigations in the past, watched from the edges of the story, sensing the possibility of something larger. Dr. Henry Lowe, the therapist Marcus had seen in passing as a PR measure, found himself called into the moral center of a man who had always deflected everything. The first signs of Lila's plan were small and almost casual, the sort of things that register as quirks until they become patterns. She left a postcard on Marcus' chest of drawers from a place he had once shuttered without a thought. She asked to see company records at a time when Marcus was still amused by her curiosity. She spoke to neighbors in the way of someone collecting threads. When Marcus confronted her in a voice that had always mediated commands before, she answered simply, "I want the truth known." That answer unsettled him more than any insult. It hinted at memory and justice, a story where he was no longer the sole author. Marcus's backstory was a tapestry of privilege and mistenderness. He had been groomed to take the reins of Vale Holdings by his father, a man who measured love in deals defended and board seats secured. Marcus learned early that affection could be purchased and fear could be turned into loyalty with well-timed bonuses. He moved through private schools, yachts, and five-star hotels, where applause replaced accountability. The sensory map of his childhood is clear to him even now. The sharp sting of cologne on his father's shirt, the metallic tang of champagne always present at celebrations, the texture of silk in rows of prepared suits, the hum of the car engine on long drives between properties, the faint, sweet smell of lemon rind from staff kitchens that served his household. He had been taught to expect compliance and had grown to mistake compliance for respect. His decisions were swift and often cruel in small increments. He cut a manager during restructuring without noticing the tremor in the man's hands. He canceled community programs deemed inefficient. He signed off on a development project over a wetland with a hand wave. He had advantages that made regret optional until someone looked him in the eye and refused his currency. Lila's backstory was rooted in scarcity and stubborn warmth. She was raised in a neighborhood where ovens burned with bread and laughter, where hard work formed the architecture of days. Her mother died when she was 19, leaving a ledger of unpaid hospital bills and a sister who depended on her. Lila learned to be large in an environment that judged softness as weakness. She remembers the sandpaper feel of her father's palms when he lifted crates at the market, the smell of boiling tomatoes in a kitchen that never had enough, the rattle of buses that took her to the community center where she volunteered, and the taste of coffee strong enough to keep her awake for the classes she took by night. She had seen people like Marcus on television, smiling while others paid the price of their decisions. When a contract worker on a construction site with ties to Vale Holdings made a mistake that cost someone dear to Lila their life, she watched promises become noise and apology become performance. She learned that courts sometimes look away. She learned to count names and dates and to keep copies of documents no one expected her to have. Her large presence was once a source of shame in a world that valued thinness, but it became a source of strength. She understood how systems obscure accountability, and she learned to persist. Their lives intersected through action and question. Julian, who had instigated the bet, was convinced this would be an amusing spectacle. He laughed often in the first weeks as Marcus attempted to convert discomfort into a game. Serena Cole, Marcus' assistant, kept schedules and whispered cautions when the press began to circle. Marco Alvarez cooked simple meals for Lila and left a note on the refrigerator with a line about dignity. Caroline Pierce dug into old filings and sent incisive emails that landed in Marcus's inbox with quiet persistence. Detective Aaron Shaw came by following a tip that suggested the bet would unearth more than a personal spectacle, and found herself curious about corporate responsibilities she had once investigated. Dr. Henry Lowe kept books on impulse control and found himself moved by a patient learning to apologize in public. Their interactions threaded the city with different perspectives on accountability. Tension escalated in stages. Marcus tried to weaponize spectacle, hosting fundraisers where he put Lila on a small pedestal to show his generosity. She accepted only if the funds went directly to families that had been affected by construction failures. The press covered the event not as a triumph, but as a question. An anonymous whistleblower sent Caroline documents showing that one of Marcus's projects had cut corners and that the company had paid hush money to keep an investigation quiet. Marcus insisted the payments were routine settlement agreements. Lila read the documents in his office, fingers tracing the names like Braille. The room smelled of cold air from the vents and the sharp citrus of the hand soap Marcus favored, and the sound of the city below felt suddenly distant. She sat and said in a calm voice, "We both know what those pages mean." The accusation landed like a plate at a dinner. It demanded a response. In a long confrontation, Lila did not speak in the acid tone of accusation that tabloids expected. She told stories. She mentioned a name that Marcus recognized from a file he had signed without reading. She told him about a man named Roberto who had worked on a site and whose daughter stopped speaking after the collapse of a low-cost building. She narrated details with the clarity of someone who had been compiling testimony for a long time. Marcus recoiled, first in the body, then in the voice. He tried to deflect, to call lawyers, to call Julian. Lila demanded the truth. The room hummed with tension, headlights from passing cars cutting through the curtains like thin knives. Marcus tried to laugh it off but failed. For the first time, laughter did not dissipate the gravity of a sentence of names and ruined lives. At that moment, the first major reveal hit like an instrument of cleansing. In a scene that lasted into the small hours, Lila produced a sealed envelope containing correspondence between Vale Holdings and a contractor named Alvarez Construction. She explained how payments had been structured to avoid public scrutiny, how a safety audit had been delayed, and how a key witness had been offered a settlement on the condition of silence. The words were precise, and the evidence was surgical. Marcus felt a fracture deep within him. He had imagined mistakes, legal compromises, small slights, but never the deliberate suppression that Lila showed him with cold clarity. He felt the walls of the penthouse close, felt once private smells and textures become the landscape of his failing defenses. He thought of his father's voice giving blunt guidance on how to handle crisis, and he realized the voice had prepared him to defend, not to repent. This revelation required a two-part response. First came the public unraveling. Caroline Pierce published a piece that named the documents with restraint and a call for accountability. Headlines followed, and Serena Cole struggled to manage damage control. Investors called, partners arranged private meetings. Detective Aaron Shaw reopened a file that had been dormant and called witnesses. The board called Marcus into a meeting that smelled of stale coffee and legal leather. He stood at a window and watched the city tilt and become a faceless sea of consequences. Then came the personal collapse. Friends who had once toasted his name turned away. Julian forbade himself from being photographed with the scandal. The social circles he had always taken for granted narrowed. Lila found herself in the crossfire of commentary and cruelty. She had set out to extract truth, not to become a spectacle. Marcus's punishment was both formal and intimate. Vale Holdings placed him under administrative restriction while the board and investigators probed. Contracts were paused. An executive who had been his ally resigned under pressure. The TV cameras multiplied like teeth. In social venues once open to him, people conversed in hushed tones at his approach. He found brands pulling sponsorship, and the veneer of invincibility peeled away into small humiliations. At an event intended to rally investors, a group of staff walked out during his speech. A caterer refused to serve him. A former friend turned his back in the middle of a gala. These were punishing and granular. They did not break him by themselves, but they rearranged his sense of self. The taste of food grew metallic. His hands trembled when he tried to sign papers. He received one angry letter from the family of a worker whose life was lost, a letter that did not ask for money, but for an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The silence that followed the letter pressed like a physical object. In the quiet that followed the collapse of his public image, Marcus found a space to consider repair. Lila had prepared for this. She asked for concrete steps, not performative gestures. She demanded that Marcus accompany her to a memorial, not a fundraiser, but a place where the families gathered. He went reluctantly, wearing a suit that felt heavy and false. The room smelled of lilies and rain, voices low and human. He sat through stories that shifted the arithmetic of his life from profit and loss to human accounts. He listened as a woman named Anna recounted how her husband had left for a job and never returned. He felt gratitude replaced by a new kind of responsibility. He began to write checks out of genuine remorse, not for headlines, but to fund medical care and child education. He visited a small clinic in the neighborhood where Lila grew up and offered to help with a renovation. Lila watched him perform these actions with a guarded expression. She wanted more than donations. She wanted changes in corporate policy, oversight, and an admission of institutional failure. Those first steps toward redemption were messy and imperfect. Marcus started attending meetings with union leaders and engineers, listening rather than dictating. He sat with Detective Aaron Shaw and offered cooperation, sharing emails and calendars that exposed past offuscations. He changed executives who had made cynical calculations a habit. He instituted a program that mandated safety audits that were independently verified and published. These were procedural descriptions that required detail and transparency. The documents he prepared were meticulous and painful to draft. They included timelines, audit procedures, and disclosure policies. The process was not quick and it was not clean. It required Marco Alvarez to testify about certain supply chains. It required Serena Cole to help gather archived communications, and it required Dr. Henry Lowe to hold Marcus accountable when his old impulses rose like ghosts. At stake in every step was whether the change was sincere. Lila demanded evidence. She asked for signed commitments in town halls. She wanted Marcus to look people in the eye and accept responsibility without legal caveats. In private conversations, their dialogue grew raw. Marcus apologized in ways that began with monologues and evolved into shorter, truer phrases. Lila pushed him, teased him, forgave him in small increments. They argued about the pace of change and whether it had been orchestrated for public consumption. They clashed about the difference between apology and atonement. Their voices in these exchanges moved from sharp to quiet. He admitted to being afraid of letting go of certain comforts. She admitted to being afraid at times that admitting pain would let the powerful forget. Two moments of tension served as the axis on which the rest of the story turned. The first came when a former contractor unexpectedly died, and new evidence suggested that the company had expedited certain approvals to meet deadlines. Marcus sat with a box of documents, the paper edges cutting into his fingers, and replayed decisions as if they were a montage of a life he had been filming but not watching. His inner monologue swung between rationalization and shame. He remembered a late-night call from his father telling him to smooth over one complaint quietly. He recalled the taste of stale coffee during board meetings where concerns were tabled. The memory of a laughing investor who suggested pushing the project faster surfaced like a ghost. The decision now lay before him to blow the whistle on executives who had made profit their only measure. The internal conflict was quick and corrosive. He chose to expose the papers and to accept the professional fallout. That choice did not undo the harm, but it shifted the balance toward transparency. The second moment was private. Lila confronted Marcus with the name of the man who had been directly responsible for the cover-up. Her voice did not tremble. She stated the case with the speed and calm of someone who had rehearsed grief into armor. Marcus felt the impact as a physical thing, a collapse in his chest. He was forced to enter a legal space where he could no longer hide behind charm and motion. He agreed to testify and to waive certain privileges. The act of standing before a hearing with families watching felt like stepping into a long corridor lined with mirrors reflecting back every choice that had been made. He recounted decisions in a way that stripped them of glamour. He spoke with the awkwardness of a man learning to take responsibility aloud. The room smelled of old wood and paper, and the silence after his testimony was loud. Public reaction evolved from schadenfreude to cautious respect. Caroline Pierce wrote follow-up pieces that conveyed both criticism and acknowledgement of Marcus' efforts. Some readers responded with derision, others with hope. The community Lila came from watched and recorded small signs of change. Donations continued to flow to families and the newly established memorial fund. The board at Vale Holdings approved structural changes. Julian, who had started this chain in a bar, found himself uncomfortable with an unpredictable outcome and retreated into private remorse. Redemption was not a singular event. It was a continuous motion of small actions integrated into daily life. Marcus volunteered at the community center, teaching financial literacy rather than lecturing. He stood in line with others for a lunch program, tasting the same food as those he had once seen from above. He learned the names of people who mattered not for votes or deals, but for the way their lives moved the city. Lila remained cautious. She watched his hands and the way they moved when he was not on camera. She allowed tenderness to creep back slowly. Their relationship transformed from performative to honest. They argued about money and pride and fear. They built rituals that were not about display. He learned to apologize in small gestures, like fixing a leaky sink on his own, or bringing low-sugar cookies to a support group because he had learned to listen to dietary needs in a way he never had before. Secondary characters played critical roles along the way. Serena Cole acted as a reluctant accomplice who moved from enabling to challenging. She confronted Marcus in an elevator once, asking why he had ignored warnings, and then she stayed on to help implement a stricter compliance program. Marco Alvarez provided nourishment and moral clarity, bringing soup and comments that cut pretense. Caroline Pierce lodged herself in the investigation with the steady patience of someone who believes in public duty. Detective Aaron Shaw reassembled a file and found enough to press charges against corporate actors who had hidden evidence. Dr. Henry Lowe guided Marcus through cognitive exercises that made apology less about show and more about integration. Anna, sister of a deceased worker, spoke at an assembly and made clear where the pain lived. Julian Price retreated and later offered a short, humbling interview where he admitted he had misjudged the outcome. The climax of the legal and moral arc arrived in two connected scenes that required both confession and consequence. In a public hearing, Marcus stood before a panel and read a statement meant to hold his company accountable. He recited details about contracts, about payments, about the lapses he had allowed. The scene was heavy with sensory details. The hearing room smelled like bleach and lemon-cleaned surfaces. Cameras whirred like insects, and the click of keyboards punctuated the silence. He described contracts with an unease that made his voice small. He acknowledged that settlements had been used to silence rather than to solve. He accepted sanctions and proposed a reparations program that included scholarships, housing support, and transparent audits. The statement was not eloquent in the way his PR team would have preferred. It was raw and honest, and when it ended, the sound in the room was the slow rustle of paper and the murmur of people who had been waiting for some sign of true accountability. The private climax was a confrontation in a small apartment where a family who had lost a son demanded that Marcus look them in the eyes and explain why he had allowed profit to eclipse care. The conversation was brutal and intimate. Marcus tried at first to offer money. The mother took his hands and said, "We do not want your money. We want to know you remember our boy." The words landed like a blow. He could feel the texture of the wooden chair under him and the way his shirt clung with sweat. He told them about deadlines, about a memo he had signed in a moment of fatigue, and about the nights he had spent trying to justify his choices. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked to be allowed to work. That request was answered not with immediate absolution, but with a cautious agreement to participate in the community rebuilding plans and a demand that his company change its ways permanently. The decision to accept the terms was a turning point for him. Rebuilding took shape in practical and symbolic acts. Marcus stepped down from a ceremonial role in the company and took on the task of overseeing safety and community relations. He moved out of the penthouse into a smaller, less conspicuous apartment for a time, not for spectacle, but to learn how to be present. He started a foundation with transparent accounting, and he opened previously closed files for review. Lila continued her work at the community center and became a central figure in overseeing how funds were distributed. She and Marcus negotiated leveled responsibilities in the newly launched programs. Their relationship matured into partnership rooted in mutual respect and accountability. They shared imperfect intimacies and small domestic chores. They also disagreed. He still sometimes reached for an old reflex to fix with money. She reminded him with patient firmness that tasks had to be done differently. The epilogue unfolds across 3 moments, mapping time and growth. 1 month later, there was a small ceremony in a renovated park where Marcus and Lila helped plant trees in memory of those lost. The press attended, but the focus rested on families and the sound of children playing. Marcus rolled up his sleeves and black soil stained his hands. People came to offer cautious congratulations, and some offered forgiveness that felt like a question mark. As a promise, Lila stood beside him, smiling with a guarded pride that had become softer. 3 months later, Vale Holdings had implemented new oversight and transparency measures. A third-party audit published a report detailing the changes. Communities recognized small but meaningful improvements, including new safety mechanisms that had been neglected for years. Marcus had started hosting monthly town hall meetings where he listened and took notes. He sometimes left the meetings with a stomachache of discomfort because the pain of hearing truth was now constant rather than occasional, but also because he had come to value that work. Lila continued to run programs at the community center and had started a small fellowship for local leaders, funded partially by the foundation that Marcus helped restructure. 6 months later, the contract that had started it all reached its end. The legal clauses expired and the public scrutiny had normalized into a more steady appraisal. Marcus and Lila stood together in a modest ceremony attended largely by people from the neighborhoods affected and a few reporters who had followed the arc. The symbolic closure was not neat. Some families still needed justice beyond payments. Some critics accused Marcus of a PR pivot. Yet there were also lives that had improved. Scholarships were active. A memorial fund supported families. The city had adopted stricter codes influenced by the audit. Marcus found that the public glare had softened into a daily responsibility he had chosen to carry. He had traded unexamined power for a life that included listening and atonement. Lila and Marcus had dared to shift their relationship from wager to a fragile trust. Throughout the story, certain technical procedures were essential to making change real. There were legal filings that required precise wording to overturn non-disclosure agreements and to reclassify certain settlements as reparative rather than punitive. The internal audit protocols were rewritten to include external oversight committees, to mandate quarterly public reports, and to require a whistleblower hotline monitored by an independent firm. Funding flows were tracked with blockchain-like ledgers to create immutable public records, and governance reforms mandated that community leaders have seats at advisory tables. These procedures were tedious and detailed, but they created a scaffolding that made individual apologies less fragile. They also took 250 to 350 words each to describe in documents and memos that Marcus read and signed, knowing each signature meant a shift. In the end, Marcus learned to turn the ledger of his life from one of transactions into one of transformations. He rebuilt trust in small, repetitive actions. Lila found that the work she had carried for years could become collective. The city watched and sometimes recoiled, but sometimes applauded. When asked later why she had accepted the wager that began it all, she said, I wanted the truth out in the open, and I wanted someone to be forced to see what they helped hide. When asked why he had agreed to change, he said, "I wanted to stop being afraid of being small." If this story moved you, tell us below what you think Marcus should do next. Start your comment with "I would do" or "I would not," and explain briefly why. Honest reflections help others think about responsibility and the pathways of repair. If you felt something watching this unfold, consider subscribing for more stories that explore the collision between power and conscience. We tell narratives that ask difficult questions and that follow people through messy attempts to make amends. There will be more stories like this one, each asking what we owe each other when institutions fail. Some debts are monetary, some are legal, but the deepest debts ask for time and courage.